always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads, just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was, the same sagging roof, the same open door, the same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: 10 days alone in the woods, completely off the grid, away from everything. No work emails, no ringing phone, no people. Just me, nature, and silence. I had done trips like this before, but never for this long and never this deep into the wilderness. The cabin I found was perfect. It was an old hunting lodge, built in the 1970s by a guy who had long since moved on. A friend of a friend knew the owner and told me I could use it as long as I respected the place. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked deep in the forests of northern Montana. No power, no running water, just a roof for walls, a wood stove, and a small well outside for drinking water. I packed carefully. Freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, plenty of firewood, a rifle, a small axe, and enough supplies to last me. I wasn't planning to hunt, but the rifle was for safety. Out here, bears were a real concern, and I wasn't about to take chances. The hike took most of a day. The trail was barely a trail at all, just an old path used by hunters years ago. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The place was just as I expected. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a heavy wooden door with a rusty padlock. I had the key, and when I stepped inside, the smell of dust, old wood, and damp filled my nose. There was a single cot against one wall, a small wooden table, and shelves with a few rusted cans of food that I wouldn't be touching. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, its black iron surface slick with years of grime. A small window looked out into the trees, but it was so dirty it barely let in any light. I spent the first night settling in, stacking firewood, boiling water from the well, and making a small meal. I sat outside for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods have a different kind of silence. It's not quiet. It's full of tiny sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite place. A feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I shook it off. First night jitters, nothing more. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water, and just enjoying the solitude. At night, I locked the door, made sure my rifle was close, and let the fire die down before sleeping. Then small things started to happen. The first was the footprints. On the fourth morning, I stepped outside and saw them. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, but as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. Barefoot, human, they weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. They were small, maybe from a child or a small adult, and they had come right up to the cabin door. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker? Maybe someone passing through? But 20 miles into the wilderness? Barefoot? That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my sleeping bag. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The next day, I made a perimeter check. I found nothing at first, but then, near the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pile of animal bones. Small ones, rabbits, birds, picked clean and stacked neatly in a little tower. I forced myself to stay calm. Could have been anything. Fox, a bobcat. Some animals hoard bones, right? But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The fire was low, just embers in the stove, and the cabin was silent except for my own breathing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of wood outside. The porch. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. I waited, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through the filthy window. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, the footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder as I stepped outside. The forest was still, the air heavy. I started down the trail, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. I made it about 5 miles before I saw it. A deer carcass hanging from a tree. It was fresh. Blood still dripped from its torn throat, pooling on the ground. It wasn't the kill that scared me. It was the way it had been strung up, its legs tied with vines, its ribs exposed like something had been picking at it. I kept moving, pushing myself harder, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I walked until my legs burned, until I couldn't go any farther. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I needed to find shelter. That's when I saw the other cabin. I hadn't seen it on any map, and it looked even older than the one I had just left. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door was missing. But it was shelter. I stepped inside, rifle ready. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rotting wood. There was an old table, broken chairs, and a fireplace filled with ash. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were words. "Don't sleep." My hands went cold. I backed away, heart pounding. That's when I noticed the footprints. All around me in the dust on the floor. Barefoot. Dozens of them. I didn't stay. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The whole way, I felt it. That awful, crawling feeling of being watched. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just moved, fast and desperate. When I finally reached my truck, the sun was nearly gone. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. And then, just before I turned the key, I saw it, in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, small, hunched, motionless, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and tore down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, Late at night, I still dream of footprints in the dirt. I don't know why I went back. I had hiked those woods before, years ago, back when I was younger and didn't know better. It was the kind of place that stayed with you, though, the kind that crept into your bones long after you left. The thick forests, the endless silence, the way the trees pressed in, heavy and watchful. It wasn't a friendly place. I had told myself I wouldn't return, but time dulls things. The older I got, the more I convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I had imagined things. So when an old buddy mentioned the cabin was still standing, deep in the woods, barely used anymore, I found myself considering it. A week alone in the mountains, away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. It didn't sound so bad. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trail had mostly disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and I had to fight through brush and deadfall to make progress. The cabin sat nearly 20 miles from the nearest road, far enough that no one just stumbled upon it. I had packed light food, water, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, and my rifle. I didn't plan to hunt, but I wasn't stupid enough to come out here unarmed. The woods had predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky that deep orange that never lasts long enough. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered. Weathered logs, sagging roof, a small porch with a single chair. The lock on the door was rusted, but the key still fit. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture was simple: an old table, a wooden chair, a narrow cot against the wall. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, blackened with years of use. A few shelves held ancient canned goods that I wouldn't be touching. It was exactly as I had left it, but as I stood there, taking it all in, that feeling crept back. The one I had forgotten, that heavy, watching silence. I shook it off. First night nerves, nothing more. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent the daylight hours hiking the nearby trails, collecting firewood, filtering water from the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The solitude felt good, peaceful even. At night, though, the feeling returned. That sense that something wasn't right. Started small. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. My gear had been moved. My rifle, which I always kept propped against the cot, was leaning against the wall by the door. My pack was half-zipped, though I knew I had closed it. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had moved things and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door. The fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. I lay still, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Another creak. The porch. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, maybe a stray hunter. But no animal would step that carefully. The sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, leading up to the porch, were footprints. Barefoot, human. The tracks circled the cabin, moving toward the door, then back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. I considered leaving, but I had hiked nearly 20 miles to get here. Another day's walk just to reach my truck. I told myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, someone passing through. I would stay one more night. That evening, I built a fire outside, keeping my rifle close. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I ate quickly, my eyes scanning the treeline. As the sky darkened, I locked the cabin door and braced a chair under the handle, just in case. I lay down, but I didn't sleep. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft shuffle of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my fingers tight around the rifle. The footsteps moved to the window. A shadow passed over the thin curtain. My chest clenched. I forced myself to stay still, to wait. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, just testing. I raised the rifle, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rattling stopped. A long silence, then soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag, my rifle slung over my shoulder. When I stepped outside, the forest was still. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy. The footprints were back, fresh. They led from the trees to the cabin. But this time, they didn't leave. I scanned the area, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been watching me was still out here. I didn't wait. I moved fast, taking the narrow trail toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. By midday, I was making good time. The sun was high, and I started to feel the first real relief in days. Then I saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, something was hanging from a tree. A deer carcass, but not just hanging. It had been tied there, its legs bound with vines, its throat slit clean, and beneath it on the ground a single object. A boot, an old, rotting hiking boot. I turned and walked faster. The rest of the hike was a blur, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping to rest. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was turning orange. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. But before I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the tree line, far enough to be blurry, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. Small, barefoot, watching. I didn't wait. I turned the key, slammed the truck into gear, and tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods. I just know that I won't be going back. I've hiked alone for years. I know the woods better than I know most people. I've never been afraid of them. Not at night, not in bad weather, not even in deep wilderness where you're days away from help. I trust my own skills. I know how to handle myself. That's why I didn't think twice about this trip. The plan was simple. A 3-day solo hike through an old, lesser-known trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't marked on most modern maps, just an old route I had read about in an old forum post. I liked hikes like that. The more remote, the better. I parked my truck at a small turnout where the dirt road ended, checked my gear, and set off just after sunrise. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in places, but I could see the faint path where people had walked before. It led up into the dense forest, winding between towering pines and thick underbrush. For the first few miles, everything was perfect. The air was cool, the ground soft underfoot. I moved fast, covering ground, getting deeper into the forest. The trees were so thick that the light barely touched the ground in places, but I didn't mind. I liked the feeling of being enclosed by nature, the silence wrapping around me like a blanket. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I stopped to eat. I sat on a fallen log, stretching out my legs, taking in the view. The trees parted just enough to give me a glimpse of the valley far below. I had no signal on my phone, but I had expected that. I took a few pictures anyway, just to mark the moment. I didn't notice anything strange at first, but looking back, I remember the moment the feeling started. A shift, a change in the air. It wasn't anything obvious, just a stillness, a sense that something had changed without me realizing it. The forest, which had been full of the usual sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had gone completely silent. I told myself it was nothing. Still, I packed up quickly and kept moving. The trail got rougher as I climbed higher. The brush got thicker, the path narrower. At times, I had to push through overgrown branches, feeling them scrape against my arms. It was clear that not many people came this way anymore. I liked that, but then I saw something that made me stop. A boot print. It was old, the edges softened by wind and rain, but still clear in the dirt. Someone had walked this trail before me, maybe months ago, maybe longer. That wasn't strange. It was a trail after all. People hiked it. But 100 yards later, I saw another one. This one was fresher, much fresher. The dirt was still loose around the edges. Maybe a day old, maybe less. And beside it, barely visible in the undergrowth, another print. Bare feet. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. It was probably nothing. Someone could have taken off their boots to wade through a stream. Maybe they were camping nearby. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept walking. The farther I went, the worse the feeling got. I couldn't explain it. Nothing had happened. I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything. But I felt it in my chest. That tight, crawling feeling like I was being watched. By late afternoon, I found a good place to set up camp. A flat patch of ground near a small creek, surrounded by trees. It was a good spot, sheltered, quiet. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore muscles, and got to work setting up my tent. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I glanced back at the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure, far up the path, just barely visible between the trees. I froze. The sun was low, casting long shadows, making it hard to see clearly. But there was something there. Person. Standing still. Too still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched. And after a long moment, so long I started to wonder if my eyes were playing tricks on me, the figure moved. Not toward me. Not away. Just sideways. Stepping into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth without a sound. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I told myself it was a hunter, someone else hiking the trail. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I finished setting up camp, trying to act normal, trying to shake the feeling. I built a small fire, cooked some food, forced myself to eat even though my stomach was tight. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. But I didn't get into my tent right away. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, listening. Nothing, not a single sound, just the crackle of the flames and the distant trickle of the creek. I didn't like it. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then a sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable, a snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I held my breath. Then another, closer. Someone was walking, slow, careful, right outside my camp. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I waited, my muscles locked, every sense on high alert, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The fire was out. The air was cold. My tent flap was still zipped. Everything looked normal. But then I saw them. Footprints. All around my campsite. Deep prints in the dirt. Some from boots. Some from bare feet. And all of them circling my tent. I stared at them for a long time, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Someone had been here, watching me, standing just outside my tent while I slept. I packed up as fast as I could. No food, no rest. Just shoved everything into my pack and started moving. I hiked faster than I ever had before. My legs ached. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how far I had gone when I finally saw it. My truck, sitting there at the edge of the woods like a lifeline. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my pack into the bed, and locked myself inside. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, heart still hammering. Then, finally, I started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a second, just long enough to make my stomach drop, I thought I saw something move in the trees. Something tall, something still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing. I'll never hike that trail again. I always preferred solo camping over group trips. I liked the silence, the solitude, the feeling of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. No schedules, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the woods. This trip was no different. I had planned it for months, choosing a remote spot deep in the wilderness of Washington state. It was far from any official campsites, a place I found on an old topo map. A valley nestled between steep ridges, with a river running through the middle. The nearest road was over 10 miles away, and even that was nothing more than an unmaintained Forest Service road. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Isolated, untouched, quiet. I started the hike early in the morning. The first few miles were on a faint, overgrown trail, but eventually I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. The forest was thick, dense with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called out from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the steady rush of water. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already dipping low. The river was just as I'd imagined it. Clear, fast-moving, lined with smooth rocks. I found a flat spot on the bank and started setting up camp. First, the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood, stacked it neatly, and got a small fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The heat felt good against the evening chill. I cooked a quick meal, ate while staring into the flames, and let my mind settle into the rhythm of the woods. As the fire crackled, I started to get that feeling. The one I always ignored at first. The prickling at the back of my neck. The sense of being watched. It was common when camping alone, just a natural reaction to being so exposed. My brain playing tricks on me, filling the silence with imagined threats. I brushed it off and focused on the fire. The woods around me were quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing unusual, but then I heard something, a soft crunch. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A footstep. I froze, my heart hammering. I listened. Silence. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just a branch falling. I waited, every muscle tensed. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I let out a slow breath and stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. The beam flickered over trunks, branches, undergrowth. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed up longer than I had planned, letting the fire burn low before finally forcing myself into the tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Every sound felt magnified, the river, the wind, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone out here. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something was wrong. I listened. The fire was out, the night deep and black. The river was still rushing, the wind still whispering through the trees. Then I heard it, a sound close to my tent. Soft, careful, a footstep. My body went rigid. I reached for my flashlight with slow, deliberate movements. My fingers wrapped around it, my thumb pressing against the switch. I waited. Another step, closer this time. I clicked the light on. The beam shot through the darkness, illuminating the thin fabric of my tent. Shadows shifted. Something moved just outside. I barely breathed. The shape didn't move for several seconds. Then slowly it backed away. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag, shoved my gear into my pack. I wanted to be gone before whoever or whatever was out there came back. As I was taking down my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. They circled my campsite, stopped just outside my tent. I hiked out fast. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Took me almost the entire day to reach my truck. When I finally saw it, sitting there on the empty dirt road, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck, tore down that road faster than I ever had in my life. I never went back to that valley. I never even told anyone about what happened. But I stopped camping alone after that. I had been planning this hike for months. Ever since I saw a post about the remote backcountry trails in Montana, I knew I had to go. The pictures showed vast, untouched wilderness, dense forests, jagged peaks, and long, winding rivers cutting through the valleys. It looked perfect, the kind of place you could go for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't well traveled. It was about 30 miles out and back, cutting through thick pine forests, over high ridges and past deep, isolated lakes. The elevation gain was brutal, but I was ready for it. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, enough food for 5 days. Everything was set. I drove out early, the sun barely up, the roads empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, there was only one other car in the lot, an old truck with faded paint and mud caked on the tires. I didn't think much of it. Probably another hiker already out on the trail. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a slow climb through dense forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. The trail was narrow, winding between massive trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds called from the branches, and now and then, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. A squirrel, maybe a deer. After about an hour, I reached the first real climb. The trail turned steep, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I leaned forward, using my trekking poles to push myself up. My breathing grew heavy, sweat starting to build under my pack. I stopped once to take a sip of water, looking back down at the forest below. The trees stretched out endlessly, dark green and unbroken. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. It was the perfect place to rest. Flat ground, a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack and sat down, stretching out my legs. I took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the clearing, near the treeline, was an old fire ring. Just a circle of blackened stones, half covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But next to it, half buried in the grass, was something else. A boot. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the laces missing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside, the insole was worn down to nothing, the toe caked with dried mud. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No pack, no other gear, just the boot. I tossed it back down and headed out. The trail dropped steeply after that, winding down into a deep valley. The trees grew thicker, the air damp and cool. I passed a stream, the water clear and fast-moving, then started the next climb. It was slow going, my legs already tired, but I pushed through. I wanted to reach the lake before dark. It was just after 6 when I finally saw the water through the trees. The lake was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick forest. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky. I found a flat patch of ground near the shore and set up my tent. After eating, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The air was still, the forest silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional ripple on the water's surface. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just a few depressions in the dirt near the water's edge. But they were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, my skin prickling. The prints were barefoot. Whoever left them hadn't been wearing shoes. And they weren't mine. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was just a wall of darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had come down for a drink. Maybe I was just seeing things. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just outside my tent. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound was close. Too close. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. When morning finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But my bear spray was gone. I packed up fast. My whole body was on edge. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it. That prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. But the old truck was gone. And nailed to a tree near the lot was something I hadn't seen before. A boot, the same one I had found on the ridge. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. No one really goes up that way, he had said. Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained, but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine. Like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I was alone in the woods, far from any road or town. deep in the thick of a national forest where the trees stood like ancient walls, their trunks rough and weathered. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the underbrush, the chirping of unseen birds, and the quiet whistle of wind slipping through the canopy. I had planned this trip for weeks, 3 days alone, just me and the wilderness. I wanted to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the stress of work, the endless notifications on my phone. I didn't bring it with me.
No GPS, no Messages, no Distractions.
Just a paper map, a compass, and a tent strapped to my back. The first day was peaceful. I hiked through miles of forest, following a winding trail that twisted through valleys and over ridges. The trees here were tall and packed tight, their branches so thick that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor in some places. When I stopped for a break, I could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional distant snap of a branch. I set up camp in a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, making a soft, trickling sound. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, a good view of the surrounding woods, and easy access to fresh water. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal from my pack. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The darkness in the woods beyond my little campsite was absolute. Without the fire, it would have been like staring into a void. I should have slept well that night, but I didn't. I woke up more than once to silence so deep it made my skin crawl. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. Just complete, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was out there, watching. The next morning, I pushed the unease aside. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I packed up my things and continued hiking deeper into the woods, away from the more traveled paths. I wanted to be completely alone out here. By midday, I reached a steep ridge that overlooked a dense valley. I climbed down carefully, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. The air down here felt different, thicker, almost heavy. The trees grew taller, their branches twisted, their trunks covered in deep grooves. The undergrowth was dense, filled with ferns and tangled roots. As I moved through the valley, I saw something that made me stop. A tree with long, deep claw marks running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. Some kind of animal, I figured. A bear, maybe. I moved on, keeping my eyes open for any sign of large predators. I had bear spray in my pack, but I knew that wouldn't help much if I startled something big. An hour later, I stumbled upon something stranger. A small pile of bones at the base of a tree. They were clean, white, picked dry. Too small for a deer, maybe a rabbit, but there were a lot of them, scattered, as if something had been feeding here. I kept moving. The day passed slowly. The deeper I went, the more I noticed little things that felt off. Trees with deep gouges in the bark. Patches of ground that looked like they had been dug up. Twisted branches that seemed to have been broken recently. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp before it got dark. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and built a fire. As I was gathering wood, I noticed something in the dirt nearby, a footprint. It was large, bigger than my own boot print. But what unsettled me wasn't the size. It was the shape. The front half looked normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever made it had been limping or dragging one leg. The fire felt like a weak barrier against the vast darkness beyond its reach. As I sat beside it, I kept my ears open, listening for anything unusual. The sounds of the forest had returned, chirping insects, the occasional rustle of leaves. But every so often, I thought I heard something else. A soft shuffling, just beyond the light of the fire. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep moving. I wasn't ready to turn back yet, but something in my gut told me I needed to be more careful. I moved faster that day, hiking hard, trying to push past the feeling that I was being followed. The deeper I went, the worse it got. More clawed trees, more scattered bones, more footprints, always with that dragging gait. By the time the sun began to dip, I knew I had made a mistake going this far. I should have turned back earlier. Now I was too deep into the woods, too far from my starting point. I set up camp in a small clearing, not bothering with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. That night, I barely moved. I lay in my tent, listening. Every sound made my heart race. At some point, I heard it again, that dragging step moving through the brush. It was slow, deliberate, closer than before. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then, slowly, they moved away, fading into the distance. At first light, I packed up and started back the way I came, moving as quickly as I could. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just walked. Sometime in the afternoon, I reached the creek where I had camped the first night. I felt a small sense of relief. I was getting closer to the edge of the forest. That relief didn't last. On the ground near the water, something was wrong. The rocks had been disturbed, the dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was a single deep footprint. Large, dragging. I didn't stop. I walked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I finally saw the edge of the woods ahead. The sight of my truck, parked where I had left it days before, nearly made me collapse with relief. I didn't look back as I threw my pack into the truck and started the engine. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of civilization. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go that deep into the woods again. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Oregon, headed for a distribution yard in Nebraska. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just interstate driving, a couple of planned fuel stops, and maybe a quick nap at a rest area if I needed it. I had been driving long haul for over a decade by then, so nothing about this trip felt unusual. I left the yard around noon, got through the mountain roads without issue, and hit the open highways by early evening. The truck was running smooth, my load was sitting right, and I had a good stretch of road ahead of me. I figured I'd push through until at least midnight before pulling over for some rest. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, but the skies were clear. Traffic was light, just a few other truckers rolling along, the occasional car passing by. I had the radio on low, sipping from a cup of coffee I had grabbed at my last stop. I was somewhere in Idaho when I saw the car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road, barely visible in the fading light. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about it seemed off. It wasn't just broken down. It looked abandoned. The hood was up, but there were no hazard lights, no signs of movement. I glanced at it as I passed. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I kept driving. Things like that happen all the time. Someone breaks down. Maybe they walk to get help. Maybe they get picked up by another driver. But something about it unsettled me. About 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same make, same model, same open door. That was when my gut started telling me something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I had driven all over the country, seen my fair share of weird things, but two abandoned cars, same type, same situation, just miles apart, that didn't sit right. I kept my speed steady, watching my mirrors, scanning the road ahead. Maybe it was some kind of coincidence, or maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Then I saw the third one. This time it was in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement. My trailer groaned under the sudden stop, the weight shifting behind me, but I kept control. The car sat there, no lights, no movement. My headlights washed over it, and that's when I noticed something else. The windshield was covered in something dark. Thick streaks like someone had smeared mud or grease across the glass. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't about to get out and check. I eased my truck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The desert stretched out on either side, nothing but open land, but something about it felt wrong. Like I wasn't alone. I took a breath, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. My trailer swung slightly as I maneuvered, my eyes flicking between my mirrors and the road ahead. Once I had enough space, I cut the wheel hard and pulled back onto the highway, rolling past the abandoned car as I picked up speed. I didn't look inside, didn't want to know. The road ahead was empty. The road behind me stayed dark. I kept driving. Maybe an hour passed. I had put enough distance between me and that stretch of highway that I started to feel a little better. The night air had cooled, my rig was running smooth, and I was getting close to the state line. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, just two tiny pinpricks of light at first, but they were moving fast, too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching in my mirrors as the lights gained on me. My pulse picked up, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a car, dark colored, same make, same model. I exhaled slow, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some guy in a hurry, flying down the highway. But I knew better. The car got closer, close enough that I could see it was the same as the ones I had passed earlier. Same shape, same dark paint, moving fast but staying just behind me. Then the headlights cut out, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I kept driving. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't stopping. Another hour passed. I kept my rig steady, rolling through the night, waiting for something else to happen. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had outrun whatever this was, I saw the taillights, not far ahead, sitting in the middle of the road. A car, dark-colored, facing the wrong way. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I gritted my teeth, checked my mirrors one last time, and kept going. The car loomed closer, my headlights hitting it full force. The driver's side door was open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. A figure, just a dark shape in the glow of my high beams. I didn't see a face, didn't want to. I hit the gas. My truck roared past, my trailer rocking slightly from the air pressure, and then the car was behind me, swallowed up by the night. I didn't stop until I hit the next truck stop, a well-lit place with plenty of other rigs parked around. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. Nothing on the news, no reports of abandoned cars. Just another quiet night on the highway, but I never took that route again.